Let's talk a little bit about unique self from an integral perspective, unique self and levels of consciousness. So here let's draw an integral distinction between states of consciousness and stages or structure stages or levels of consciousness, which are all words that are used interchangeably in integral theory. So a state of consciousness is a state that's usually transient. I might add, not always. There's a strong claim in Kabbalah and Sufism that there are different kinds of states of consciousness, and that some, once attained, leave a lasting and irreversible impression. However, for the most part, states of consciousness are in some sense ephemeral. They come, they expand your consciousness, they give you a deeper, wider, more profound view of the true nature of reality, and then they recede. Now, these states can be positive. They sometimes can be negative. You can have a drunken state. You can have, and this is neutral, depends on what the context is, an orgiastic state. There are many forms of mystical states. So they come, they're there, they recede, and leave some level of permanent or non-permanent memory. That's a state of consciousness. A stage or a structure stage or a level of consciousness is talking about a unique developmental stage or structure of consciousness that exists along different lines of development. So, for example, if we're talking about motor development, there's the structure stage before you've learned to ride a bike and after you've learned to ride a bike. I have a young son who's awesome and gorgeous and beautiful, Zion, who's about 20 months old. And I've watched him develop over the last 20 months. Every time I see Zion, right, who's being raised by his awesome mother, Mariana, with some good help from me, right? Zion is so awesome. And every time you see in 20 months, each time he can do something new. You know, he can do something new from a perspective of motor coordination, the most obvious being walking. But it's much more than walking. You actually see all these incremental stages where he gains a new skill that he didn't have before. So those are structure stages of development. Right? You can have a musical line of development. You can have an emotional line of development. You can have a moral line of development. So, for example, along a moral line of development, there's talk, Kohlberg's students in integral theory, of 4 core levels, right, or structure stages, or stages of moral consciousness. There's egocentric consciousness, where my felt sense of caring and concern is really just for me and those who help me survive and sustain myself in the world. That's egocentric consciousness. Then you upgrade a level, you transcend and include. You don't lose your egocentric sense of love, care, and concern, but you expand, you widen your felt sense of caring and concern to include your entire group, your tribe, your nationality, your people, your country. So that's been called alternatively sociocentric consciousness or ethnocentric consciousness. Right? Your sense of felt caring and concern is with your people, your tribe. So there's an expansion. Then you transcend and include. You retain your sense of loyalty to your inner group and to yourself, right? To your people, to your tribe. But now your sense of felt love, caring, and concern expands and now includes all of humanity. You have a world-centric consciousness. And then level 4, it still expands again, and you move from world-centric to cosmocentric consciousness, where your felt sense of caring and concern includes not only all of humanity, but perhaps all sentient beings. Perhaps it also will begin to blur the distinction between sentience and non-sentience. Perhaps it'll blur the distinction between past, present, and future. You actually shift perspectives. And at a fully awakened cosmocentric perspective, you actually are at this heightened level of moral consciousness, right, in which you actually realize also your full identity with the Godhead. And that's a very, very expanded state of moral consciousness, cosmocentric consciousness. So that's an example of structure stages of consciousness. And there are different systems, right? There are different developmental systems that identify right, in different ways, various ways of telling the story of different structure stages of consciousness. Famous among them, right, is a system developed by Clare Graves and expanded by his students Chris Cowan and Don Beck called spiral dynamics, which color codes, right, the levels of consciousness. Suzanne Cook-Greuter, has done fantastic work in terms of levels of consciousness, and there's been really important conversations between Suzanne Cook-Greuter and myself, recorded conversations which were published in the Journal of Integral Theory and Practice on unique self, 6.1, on the relationship between unique self and levels of consciousness. So Suzanne's done really important work there. Don Beck has done important work on levels of consciousness. Each one has, Don's doing the spiral dynamic system. Jane Lovinger, right, preceded Suzanne Cook-Greuter, did important work. Bill Torbett did enormously important work. Robert Keegan, right, did very, very important work. Jenny Wade, right, from a different perspective, did very important work. There's a whole school of probably 100 different developmentalists, dating back to Baldwin and Peirce, right, who are all developmental theorists who trace the stages, the structure stages of human development. Okay. So there's states and there's stages. Stages, once attained, are permanent. They don't go away. And each stage is unique and distinct, and each stage builds on a previous stage, and you can't skip a stage. You've actually got to go through all the stages. So those are states and structure stages, or states and levels. Now, what is unique self? So unique self, the core way we refer to unique self is as both a unique structure stage of consciousness and a state of consciousness. We need to identify and distinguish between them. Fundamentally, primarily, it's a specific structure stage of consciousness that comes online as a natural, spontaneous expression, right? You naturally live into your uniqueness, right, at higher levels of consciousness. Now, of course, knowing about unique self might be one of the things that spurs you, right, that causes you to grow up to higher levels of consciousness. That's the transmission, the teaching, the study of unique self is part of what actually awakens you. But when you actually awaken to and you grow up to, right, higher levels of consciousness, in one system it's called infrared or violet, right? In another system it's identified, earlier as yellow, which is an earlier stage, right? Unique self begins to come online in a natural way. And in a very important dialogue I did with Don Beck, another dialogue with Suzanne Cook-Greuter, we actually identified, right, at what stage of consciousness unique self begins to come online. And for Don, right, that was at what he calls yellow, which is the beginning of second-tier consciousness. And for Suzanne, it was also, right, at her term for the emergence, right, of kind of second-tier consciousness, construct-aware. And actually really even the level before construct-aware, you have the beginning, right, of this unique self-consciousness. So unique self comes online as a spontaneous structure stage of consciousness, which is a natural expression of self at these higher levels of consciousness. And in that sense, unique self is a demarcating feature of second-tier consciousness, of the higher levels, right, of consciousness, the higher structure stages of consciousness. So that's one expression of unique self. What's also true is that when you awaken to true self, which is your classical enlightenment, you've moved from separate self to true self, you also then realize that true self, when you're fully awake, you realize only sees through a unique set of eyes. And when you realize true self only sees through a unique set of eyes, you realize that actually your awakened state of true self is actually a state of unique self. That realization, right, takes place at second-tier consciousness. That's the paradox. Is when you have this higher level of structure stage consciousness, right, of unique self, then you realize that your awakened self, right, you're awakening to a state of expanded self, actually is not only awakening to true self, which is, right, you're merging with the one, it's actually also awakening to unique self, because every true self sees with a unique set of eyes. So that's 2. 3, unique self exists as a reality all the way up and all the way down, right? All levels of consciousness. Unique self is always true, right? Uniqueness is the nature of form. But uniqueness doesn't awaken to itself until the higher levels of consciousness. Evolution is always happening. But only recently, in the third great cycle of evolution, after physical evolution, which takes billions of years, which is followed by biological evolution, which takes millions of years, which is followed by cultural evolution, which is tens or hundreds of thousands of years, depending how you tell the story. And at some point, recently, very recently, maybe in the last 100 years, evolution begins to awaken to itself and begins to become conscious evolution. So unique self is always true. And uniqueness is always the nature of self, and uniqueness is always the nature of all sentience. However, when unique self awakens to itself, you have a higher evolutionary emergent of consciousness, which is why we've called unique self, right, the evolutionary emergent of unique self, a new chapter in integral theory, which is the title of my article on the same in the Journal of Integral Theory and Practice 6.1. So I know that this entry, this conversation, was a very theoretical one. If you're not a theory person, you're saying, what is he talking about? But if you are a theory person, this is enormously important to you. I hope it's helpful.